Chapter 7 of The Ghost Girl by Henry Kitchell Webster. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. The Face Under the Paint. I went back with Geoffrey to the studio after lunch, although I was uneasily conscious that my office chair was yawning for me. Geoffrey's affairs are always so much more interesting than my own that there isn't as much generosity and self-sacrifice as he credits me with in my ready devotion to his. We found Richards, the police lieutenant, waiting for us. "I'm sorry to have kept you," said Geoffrey, "but I found I needed a square meal." "Oh, I don't mind waiting," Richards assured him. "But you missed a caller." "A caller?" said Geoffrey. He and I exchanged a glance. "Crow?" I whispered under my breath. "He didn't leave his name," said Richards. "He's the rug man." "Oh," said Geoffrey indifferently. "Did he wait long?" "No," said the lieutenant. "He examined the rug rather carefully and said he'd let you know about it in the morning." "Which rug was it?" I asked. "The one over there by the door. That's the right one, isn't it?" The lieutenant asked the last question of Geoffrey. "Oh, yes," said Geoffrey. "He knew which one it was right enough. Do you remember what he looked like?" "Why," said the lieutenant, "he was a pretty tall, good-looking, dark—" "Oh, you needn't describe him," Geoffrey interrupted. "Just remember him. You may meet him again some time." The lieutenant laughed. "What? Is he one of your, what do you call them, latent criminals?" "I don't know," said Geoffrey, "but it will do you no harm to remember what he looked like." We ensconced Richards in the big chair and provided him with a big cigar. Geoffrey went over to his paint table and began an elaborate pretense of setting it to rights. "Well," he asked, "any luck with my little affair? Are you going to be able to get that portrait back for me?" The lieutenant unctuously licked the wrapper of his cigar and favoured it with the caressing gaze of a connoisseur before he answered. He was in very good humour with himself. "I have got it," he said. "Already?" I cried. "The lieutenant had the right guess this morning," said Geoffrey. "I suspected as much." "But you couldn't figure out what the guess was," said Richards. Then he turned to me. "I don't mind admitting, Mr. Drew, that this young fellow has pulled some long shots in the crime detecting business that the front office has never been able to understand. You saw one of them yourself, and they tell me you wrote a book about it. But when it comes right down to cases, an old professional thief-catcher like me has got a few tricks of his own. Mr. Geoffrey here might have worked his game. Whatever it is, I don't pretend to understand it, for 5 years and he wouldn't have found it. But he came to me, and I put my hand on it in 15 minutes. Oh, you will see for yourself," he went on, for both of us showed the surprise we felt at his announcement. "They'll bring it up in the wagon. It'll be here any time now. But the next time, Mr. Drew, that you write a detective story, you might give the police a little credit. It was near 11 o'clock when Mr. Geoffrey made his complaint." He pulled out a big gold watch in a hunting case and looked at it impressively. "His picture'll be back here before 2. That's 3 hours. Mr. Geoffrey never worked any quicker than that himself, and as I told you, he wouldn't have got it back himself in 5 years. "Oh, come," said Geoffrey, "there aren't as many fences as that in town. I shouldn't have known the right one to go to first, but I know something about them. Besides, I could probably have advertised a reward and got it eventually." "You could have advertised?" said the lieutenant, until you were black in the face, and you could have gone to every fence in New York City if you knew where they were, which you don't, and at that you would never have found it." "All right," said Geoffrey. "You've got me. I'd like to know how you did it." "Well," said Richards, "you've made me ask that question a good many times, and turnabout is fair play. This is the way I figured it out. To begin with, pictures don't get stolen. Frames do, sometimes, and if there's a picture in the frame, it may go along too. But this picture wasn't in a frame." "It seems to me," said Geoffrey, "I remember hearing about a picture called the Mona Lisa in Paris that was stolen, and then there was that Gainsborough that Pinkerton got back." "Oh, sure, that kind of pictures," said the lieutenant impatiently. "Pictures out of galleries. What I mean is the kind of pictures you paint." Geoffrey laughed. "I appreciate the distinction," he said. "Go ahead." "There'd be no use taking such a thing," the lieutenant went on, "because it wouldn't be possible to dispose of it. No regular fence would know what to do with it. If a man had stolen it, the only thing for him to do would be to get into communication with you and try to make you ransom it. And what should you pay to ransom it for, when you can paint another?" Geoffrey concealed his grin this time, and he asked, demurely enough, "Then the next step in your reasoning would be, I should think, that since pictures of this sort are never stolen, it follows that mine wasn't." "Exactly," said the lieutenant. "That's the way I figured it out. It wasn't stolen at all. It was borrowed." We both exclaimed at that. "Borrowed," repeated the lieutenant impressively. "The borrower hasn't been in any hurry to return it," said Geoffrey with a laugh. "He meant to return it," said the lieutenant, "but he couldn't return it." Geoffrey looked around with a quick frown of interest. "I've been expecting to catch up with you every minute," he said, "but I'm as far behind you as ever. How did you settle in your mind who this borrower had been?" "You gave me the clue to that," said Richards. "You told me you had painted the portrait from a photograph of a lady who was dead. Do you remember that I asked you how much they were going to pay you for it? You thought the question was none of my business, and you only gave me a general idea of the amount. But it was enough to go on. And then you said that as soon as you finished it, you went away on a 3 months' vacation." "Do you mean to say," asked Geoffrey, "that the amount I had been paid for painting the picture helped to guide you to the discovery of the borrower of it?" "It's like this," said Richards. "Anybody who would pay as many thousands as that for a portrait of a person who is dead must have a good deal of interest in that person, and must have a lot of money left for other purposes. Now, anybody with lots of money and with exceptional interest in a person recently dead is particularly good game for one sort of crook. That crook is the spiritualist. You haven't been in the city in the last few months. If you had, and had kept up your interest in the doings of the police, you would have known there was a crusade on against the spiritualists. There are a number of very clever ones in the city, and they have pulled off some pretty big hauls. When they picked old man Martin clean and left his heirs holding the bag, they went a little too far, and we got after them. It's wonderful how much they know, how carefully they watch people. That's the whole thing in their game, of course. They're prepared to take advantage of any opportunity that comes along." The lieutenant got up, walked across the studio, and threw open the door into the reception room. "I thought I'd see if your Jap boy had come back," he said. "Come back?" said Geoffrey. "He shouldn't have gone out. He ought to be here now." "He slipped away just after he let me in," said Richards, "and I've an idea you won't see him again, unless you want him for something, and in that case you'll have to come to us to find him for you. He's just the sort those people try to get hold of. They can pick up lots of interesting things. Japs always love to be spies, and they have exceptional facilities for it, because people talk before them as they wouldn't before anyone of their own sort." "Well," said Geoffrey, "that's one on me. I've talked before him myself, as if he'd been a plaster image. Goodness knows what he may not have found out about me. But I'm beginning to get the idea, I think. My Jap tips it off to some spiritualist that I am painting the portrait of a young lady who died a short time ago, that the person who commissioned me to paint it is wealthy, and then, by a lucky coincidence, that I was closing my studio and going off for a vacation. The spiritualist pays for the tip, comes up and borrows the portrait with the idea of getting it safely back in place before my return. But before he gets through with it, his place is raided and the portrait seized. That's the chain of reasoning, isn't it?" The lieutenant nodded. "And when you thought it out as far as that," Geoffrey went on, "you went up into some sort of lumber room up there at police headquarters and hauled it out from a heap of other junk you'd confiscated when you raided their place." "Right you are," said the lieutenant. "It's even possible," Geoffrey went on, "that you remembered that that very picture had been brought in." "What if I did?" said Richards. "I had to figure it out, that that picture might be yours, didn't I?" "Yes," said Geoffrey, "and it's a good job." "I still don't see it," said I, "what the spiritualist wanted to borrow the portrait for." "Why, to make up a ringer from, of course," said the lieutenant. "Don't you see?" said Geoffrey. "With that picture to work from, they'd be able to produce a materialization that would be mighty effective. They get pretty good ones from just hearsay reports of what people looked like. But with a portrait that showed the color of the hair and eyes and the type of complexion, that even reproduced in some detail a dress that had belonged to her." He broke off short and stood staring at us for a minute. Then without another word he rushed over to a big wardrobe and began pulling out its contents. They were very miscellaneous. All sorts of costumes, dresses, bits of drapery, old shawls. One at a time he flung them out into a heap on the floor. It was a simple but efficacious way of looking for something, and, to as unmethodical a man as Geoffrey, the only one. "Well," he said at last, turning to face us when the wardrobe stood empty, "they must have got that too. They gave me the girl's own dress to paint the portrait from," he went on. "I posed a model in it for the figure. They evidently took that too. By Jove, that's almost as awkward as the loss of the picture." "Oh, well," said Richards, "I can probably get it back for you. You will have to come down to headquarters and identify it, but it's undoubtedly there with the rest of the junk. But you can see how slick the game is," he went on, "with the gown itself and the portrait to make up from. They could have made the old lady think she was seeing ghosts all right, once they got their hooks into her." Geoffrey paled a little and spoke to me with an uncertain little laugh. "More ghosts," he said. "It's queer the way it all fits in, isn't it, Drew?" I nodded. For my own sake, as well as Geoffrey's, I was glad we had that earring, the one solitary material assurance we possessed that we weren't dreaming, or worse. For no mind, not even a solid, prosaic mind like my own, can resist a series of coincidences for very long. The notion that this portrait of the ghost girl that had so mysteriously disappeared had been found again in the parlours of a spiritualist gave me a queer sense of discomfort. The lieutenant was looking from Geoffrey's face to mine in a puzzled, interested sort of way. "More ghosts?" he questioned. "What do you mean by that? Have you been seeing them, you too?" Neither of us had an answer ready for him, and before we could think of one, there came a ring at the bell. "That's possibly the portrait now," said Geoffrey. He had guessed right, for there in the doorway stood a big policeman carrying in his arms what was evidently a big canvas wrapped in brown wrapping paper. "I told them to do it up carefully," said the lieutenant. "After I heard the price they were going to pay for it, I began to see things different. I didn't think it was anything so very much when they brought it in." Jeffrey laughed. "You're very much like everybody else when it comes to art criticism. They all want to see the price on the back before they know whether to get enthusiastic or not." "Well," said the lieutenant, "when I went back this morning and took another good look at it, I could see that it might be something pretty good." Under his directions, the policeman brought the canvas in and leaned it against the wall. "That's all," he said. The policeman saluted and turned to go. I heard the clink of a coin as Jeffrey slipped his hand into his pocket and followed him out of the door. "Now," he said, as he returned a moment later, "now for a look." He carried the canvas, still in its wrappings of paper, over to his big studio easel and set it up. Then carefully and eagerly he began cutting the strings that held the paper in place. Then with a single motion he stripped the paper away and stepped back to get the full effect. He looked at the thing, at first with a stare of simple incomprehension. Then his face turned red, and with a snort of anger he wheeled round on the lieutenant. "What sort of a fool joke is this?" he demanded. For my own part, astonishment held me for a moment, just as it had held Jeffrey, and then I burst into a shout of uncontrollable laughter, for, of all the ridiculous daubs that ever disgraced a canvas, this particular atrocity was certainly the worst. You have probably seen in the show window of a department store a painter turning out genuine oil paintings at the rate of 4 or 5 an hour to be given away to the store's patrons with every $5 worth of purchases. Well, this oil painting looked a good deal like that, only it was much bigger and very much worse. "Isn't it yours?" asked Richards. "Mine!" shouted Jeffrey. "No, I should say it was not mine." "All right," said the lieutenant. "All right. I don't see anything to get sore about. It was there, and it corresponded to the description." "Corresponded?" Jeffrey looked at him blankly for a second, then looked back at the canvas, and then he too began to laugh. "You're quite right, Richards," he said when he got his breath. "You're quite right. It does correspond to the description. It's a blonde girl. At least she's meant for a girl, and that yellow swab stands for blonde hair, and that ghastly mess of white paint may have been meant for a white satin gown." Jeffrey got his breath with difficulty. "It's all right," he assured the lieutenant. "You did your best, and it was very clever of you, really." "Oh, laugh, laugh," said the lieutenant. "Go on, don't mind me." For Jeffrey was overcome at this point by a fresh paroxysm. "You didn't think much of it when you first saw it," he gasped, "but when you had another good look you saw that it might be pretty good." "They all look alike to me," said Richards, "and I thought if some nut would pay $6,000 for it, there must be something there." "Drew," said Jeffrey, "hand the lieutenant a fresh cigar and get him a drink. We'll all have a drink," he said, "to the brilliant future of the painter and to the long life of his subject." The lieutenant began to get his good humour back again. He smiled rather ruefully. "Well, my boy," he said, "I'm glad you didn't paint it, that's the truth, because I was thinking that if you got $6,000 for a thing like that, you painters must be almost as ripe for a raid as the spiritualists." He settled back comfortably with his fresh cigar and began rolling the joke around in his capacious head. He was enjoying it more and more every minute. Jeffrey, on the contrary, seemed suddenly sober. He paid no attention whatever to the lieutenant's jokes, but stood in front of that atrocious canvas, his hands deep in his trousers pockets, his head sunk forward on his shoulders, staring at it in a thoughtful abstraction. "Coming to see something in it at last yourself, are you?" said the lieutenant. "Yes," said Geoffrey seriously, "I am." He lifted the stretcher from the easel, turned it around, and looked at the back of it, rubbed his fingers over the canvas, then replaced it on the easel and stared at it a little longer. Then, with a sudden air of decision, he went over to his paint table and came back with a big tin pot of unpleasant-looking blackish-green salve. In another minute, with the aid of a palette knife, he was rapidly smearing this stuff all over the surface of the canvas. "Hold on," said Richards. "That thing may not be much good, but it's somebody's darling. I can't let you spoil it." The hand that held the palette knife went on all the faster. "Don't you worry," said Geoffrey. "I'm not spoiling it. I'm increasing its value about 20,000%. There was a ring of excitement in his voice that I couldn't account for, but whenever Geoffrey spoke in that particular tone, I stopped trying to interfere with him. He knew what he was about when he talked like that. Richards still looked uneasy. "Don't you worry," said I. "I don't know what he's doing, but he does." In another minute the canvas was completely covered with a thick, greasy, blackish-green smear. Geoffrey dropped the pot on the floor in his eagerness and fairly ran out of the studio into a little bathing and dressing room that was partitioned off in the corner. "He may have improved it," said Richards dubiously, "but I doubt if the man who painted it would think so." The next minute Geoffrey came back with a bucket of water and a big bath sponge. "Now you'll see," he said. He dipped the sponge in the water and began washing off the stuff he had just put on. It seemed to be taking the paint with it. And then I got a clue. As his sponge swept over the horrible pink daub that had been a hand, another hand appeared under it, an exquisite, slender hand, painted as only Geoffrey himself can paint them. The next stroke carried away a whole section of white paint, and underneath it showed the shimmer of satin in long, broken folds. "Well, I'll be damned," said Richards. "The real picture's underneath." "You've solved the mystery," said Geoffrey excitedly. "It is." He hadn't got to the face yet. He seemed to be leaving that to the last, but already we could see, in the simple grace of the folds, the beautiful painting of the figure, the exquisite tones of the background, that the picture was one of extraordinary beauty. "Let's see the face, man," said Richards. "Let's see the face." "In a minute," said Geoffrey. Faster and faster flew the big sponge, and more of the disfiguring paint that disguised it came away, leaving the original picture under its protecting coat of heavy varnish, intact. "Now," said Geoffrey, and with the last stroke of his great sponge he wiped the pink and yellow daubs away from the face and hands. "There she is," he said at last. "What do you think of her?" He wrung out his sponge, tossed it away, and began wiping his hands on a bath towel before he became aware of the tense silence, of the sudden mystery that was holding Richards and me spellbound. We stared at that face, and from it back into each other's, and then at the face again. "Well," said Geoffrey, "what's the matter with you fellows? Speak up. Was the person who paid $6,000 for it such a nut after all, Richards?" But the question passed unheeded. The lieutenant's face was grey, but his eyes were shining with excitement. For myself, I was trembling all over, and I found it hard to speak steadily. "You recognize it, don't you?" I asked in a low tone. "It's the face." "Not a doubt about it in the world," he said. "It's the face. I couldn't forget it in 1,000 years. I saw it, you know, just after they found it." "What do you mean?" said Geoffrey. "What are you talking about?" "That," said Richards. "That's the girl they found frozen in the ice. The girl nobody's been able to identify." End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of The Ghost Girl by Henry Kitchell Webster. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. An Even Break. "Do you mean," asked Geoffrey, "the girl Gwendolen was telling me about last night? The girl who had been murdered and thrown into the river?" "That's who he means," said Richards. "This is the first clue we have found as to who she might be. What do you know about her?" Geoffrey didn't answer. He was looking at the face on the canvas as studiously and intently as if he were seeing it for the first time. Richards repeated his question. "What do you know about her?" "Nothing," said Geoffrey. There was another silence. "Come along, then," said Richards impatiently. "I want to find out all you know about her." "I know nothing about her, I tell you," said Geoffrey. "I never even heard of her till last night." "You painted her portrait?" said the lieutenant. "Oh, if that's what you want," said Geoffrey, "I can tell you a little, but not very much. This is the portrait of Miss Claire Meredith. She was, I understand, a very charming young lady with considerable artistic talent and the expectation of a very large fortune, which she would have inherited from a wealthy maiden aunt, had she survived her. As it is, this young lady died 3 years ago in Paris of smallpox. Her aunt, who is as rich as she is eccentric, and as eccentric as she is rich, has ever since been inconsolable over her loss, and last November commissioned me to paint this portrait. If you want to find out more about the young lady, you will have to go to the old one." "You never saw the girl yourself? You said she lived in Paris, didn't you?" "She died the year before I made my last visit to Paris," said Geoffrey. "I painted this from a photograph." The lieutenant was looking thoughtfully at the canvas now himself. Geoffrey laughed. "No spirit painting about this, Lieutenant. The spirit portrait was the one I washed off just now." "Well, it's a good picture of her, all right. Of the girl they found in the ice, I mean. It's almost as good as a photograph of her. You can see who it's meant for right off." "Did you happen to notice," asked Geoffrey suddenly, "whether this paint was wet? I mean the outer coat that had been put on over this when it was brought into the station?" "I couldn't say," Richards answered. "I don't believe so, though, because it would have messed up everything if it had been. There wasn't any cover over it. Why?" "I was wondering," said Geoffrey, "why they painted over it. Of course, the obvious explanation would be that the raid had been tipped off, just as police raids usually are." "Like hell they are," said Richards. "If ever anyone was caught with the goods, that bunch was. Tipped off. Who do you think you're talking to?" Geoffrey laughed. "To an ornament to the force," he said. "But you needn't look so fierce about it. I'm not a reformer. And anyway, in this case, if the raid had been tipped off, the paint would have been wet on the canvas. Unless, of course, they got hold of the schedule of raids several days in advance." The lieutenant snorted. He was too indignant for articulate remonstrance. "But I can't think of any other reason," Geoffrey went on, "why they should take the trouble to disguise the picture." "You can't you?" said Richards. "No," said Geoffrey, "and I don't believe you can." "Well then, Mr. Sherlocko, you'd better stick to painting portraits and leave crime to the police. I'm just a plain blue coat, but I can see a reason." He gave his attention to the portrait again, held up his hands so that they framed off the shining mass of hair, and scrutinized the mask itself. "It's like her," he said, "but only in a general sort of way." "What is the reason, then?" said Geoffrey, apparently paying no attention to this last remark. "It's so simple," said the Lieutenant, "I'm ashamed to tell you." "Out with it," said Geoffrey. "I play fair. I acknowledge when I'm wrong. You certainly did a good job in getting this portrait back. That was a fine clean piece of reasoning." "Well," demanded Richards, "doesn't that reasoning help you to find a reason why they should disguise the portrait? Why did they take it in the first place? Because they wanted a ringer for this dead girl, so that the old dame who ordered the portrait—" He didn't bother to complete the sentence, but went on thoughtfully after a moment's silence. "You say she hasn't any family?" Geoffrey nodded. "And that she's rich and nutty?" "Eccentric was my word," said Geoffrey. "And that she can't get over losing the girl," Richards went on. "Why, the thing's as plain as the nose on your face." Geoffrey stroked the member thoughtfully. "Well," he said, "you're putting it all over me to-day. Perhaps I can work it out after a night's sleep." Richards got up decisively and put on his overcoat. "Well, I've done theorizing enough for one day," he said. "Now I'm going to get busy." "I don't suppose you'd tell us what you are going to do for anything in the world?" said Geoffrey. "Oh, I don't mind telling. I've got nothing up my sleeve. Everything done in full sight of the audience. I'm going to round up those spiritualists." Geoffrey laughed. "Good luck to you," he said. There was a step in the corridor outside, a short double ring at the bell, and a miscellaneous assortment of letters fell through the mail slot in the door upon the floor inside. Geoffrey went over in a leisurely way and began picking them up. He always had a large, variegated, and interesting-looking mail, but the thing that was absorbing his attention just now was a Japanese picture postcard. It absorbed him so completely that Richards delayed his farewell, and both of us stood watching him curiously. "How are you going to find those spiritualists?" he asked at last. "You've put them out of business, haven't you?" "Oh, they're not far away," said the Lieutenant. "We'll find them. It may be rather a long job from your point of view, but I think we'll have them in a week." "I've a notion," said Geoffrey, "that I can help you find them." "Coming to life, are you?" laughed the Lieutenant. Geoffrey nodded. "Your theory is that my Jap has bolted," he said. "In other words, that he was in cahoots with those spiritualists. Very likely they have some other member of his family working for them. Openly, I mean." "All right so far," said Richards. "But what good does that do? I'd rather find 3 spiritualists than 1 Jap. They're the meanest kind of a proposition to lay hands on." "Here you are, then," said Geoffrey, and he handed the postcard to the Lieutenant. I looked at it frankly over his shoulder and was as completely puzzled by it as he. It was addressed to Togo, to be sure, and postmarked at the 23rd Street Post Office here in New York. But on the reverse side there was nothing at all but a familiar little Japanese picture of Fuji, with a few snaky trees and a seagull or two in the foreground, and a couple of vertical lines of Japanese characters printed on the side. The Lieutenant looked at it blankly. "What's the idea?" he asked in rich scorn. "Me to go to the 23rd Street substation and ask them who mailed this, and if he happened to leave his address?" "I've an idea that his address is on it," said Jeffrey. "Only, unfortunately, I can't read Japanese." "Where's there any Japanese except what's printed down the side here?" "It isn't printed," said Jeffrey. "That's the point. Look at it slantwise and you'll see, if your fingers aren't sensitive enough to feel it, it's been written on in India ink, in a wonderfully careful imitation of printing. Let it warm under your thumb for a minute and you'll find it's sticky." "What makes you think it's got anything to do with our mystery, even so?" I asked. "It's got to do with some mystery anyway," said Jeffrey. "A Jap could have dashed off that message in 2 minutes, writing in the ordinary way. This job must have taken him an hour or 2. He was willing to go to that trouble rather than have anyone suspect that Togo was getting communications of any sort from his own people. A sealed letter might be opened. A message, that looked like a message, might be read. This thing was calculated to slip by as something too unimportant to look at." The Lieutenant was studying the postcard as if he couldn't be quite sure whether Jeffrey was joking or not. "You're the original self-acting mystery maker, all right," he said. "What will you bet it doesn't say J. Shimboshi Postcards and Novelties, Tokyo, or something of that sort?" "Find somebody who can read it," said Jeffrey, "and if it says anything like that, I'll buy you the finest dinner at Churchill's you ever sat down to." "That goes," said Richards in a manner that he meant to sound a little heartier and more confident than it really was. Jeffrey had a diabolical way of hitting it right, even when he founded his guesses on such trifling and tenuous grounds as this. The Lieutenant waved a large hand to us in amiable farewell, and took his departure, his footsteps resounding in a steady decrescendo as he strode down the corridor. As soon as he was fairly gone, Jeffrey dropped into his big chair, limply, like a man who was tired. His failure to follow the policeman's train of thought was so new an experience that it was no wonder he took it hard. But he looked as he sat there like a man who has just come through some exhausting effort. Neither of us spoke for quite a while. "I've played fair with Richards, I think," he said. "How about it? Do you agree with me? It really looks to me like an even break, only each of us takes the line that suits his talents." "I'm afraid I don't quite understand you," said I. "But I do think you played fair with him, absolutely. In fact, I thought it was mighty good of you to give him that hint about the postcard when he had been so cagey with you about his explanation of the portrait. About their reason for putting the paint over it, I mean." Jeffrey got up rather suddenly and went to his paint table where he stood with his back to me, busy among his colours. "So," I went on, "I don't see how there can be any question about your playing fair. But, Jeffrey, I believe I see what he was driving at, in a general sort of way, that is." "Do you?" he said in a queer voice. Still he didn't turn around. "Yes," said I. "You remember he thought they borrowed the portrait in order to help them find and make up what he calls a ringer. Somebody that they can impose on Miss Meredith's credulity with. Well, Jeffrey, suppose they found her. Found somebody almost miraculously like what Claire Meredith must have been. Suppose right in the middle of their work that girl disappeared and then was found in the ice. Perhaps one of them murdered her. Perhaps they knew someone who was likely to have murdered her and were afraid to tell what they knew. Anyway, they kept still about it, and then, all at once, it occurred to them that it wouldn't do to have anyone see that portrait. It would lead to too many questions. So they daubed it over with paint. I believe that's Richard's idea. You know he said he was going to round up the spiritualists." Geoffrey turned round toward me weakly. There were tears in his eyes, but they were tears of suppressed laughter. He shook his head at me and wiped the tears away. "Drew," he said, "you will be the death of me some day." "What's the matter?" I asked. "Why, you dear old dub," said he. "Didn't you see that I was pounding away till my arms ached, trying to get that idea into that policeman's thick head?" "Oh, come," said I, "don't try to work through a bluff like that. You were puzzled, and I think you might admit it. I know you see most things quicker than I do, but once in a while—" "Drew," he said, "listen. Do you remember that as soon as you told me of the, well, call it resemblance of this face here to that of the girl they found, that I told Richards decisively how she had died of smallpox 3 years ago, that her rich, eccentric aunt was alone in the world and was inconsolable over her loss? Could I have done any more, short of saying in so many words, to suggest to Richards that they meant to impose on the old lady with a resemblance? When I challenged him to find a reason why the paint had been put on this canvas, was there any possible way left open to him to explain it but the way he took? But why didn't you say it right out? That's what I want to know." "Because," said Geoffrey, "I wanted Richards to believe that the idea was really his. I wanted him to take it seriously. He's got an idea that my notions are fanciful, that I have a lucky way of guessing. The only way I could make him take that notion seriously, and could divert him from the other course that lay open to him, was by leading him to believe that he was getting the better of me, putting one over on me. I thought that you were on to the game all the while. You certainly played up to me as if you were." Then he laughed again, but for once his mirth couldn't charm a smile out of me. I felt very ill used and rather sulky. "Come," he said, "you really have to forgive me for that. It was too perfectly delightful to hear you going on so seriously, telling me all about it." "All right," said I, "only the next time you really want any sympathy from me, look out." "I shall get it," said Geoffrey soberly. "God knows I needed it badly enough this morning, and you were there with the goods. I don't know what I should have done without you." "All right," said I, "you're forgiven. You always are. But, Geoffrey, what was the other course of action that lay open before Richards? What was it you didn't want him to do?" Geoffrey didn't answer, but his face became intensely thoughtful again. "An even break," he said. "I honestly believe it's an even break. But we'll wait and see." End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of The Ghost Girl by Henry Kitchell Webster. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. Fighting the Devil with Fire. I was just finishing up an afternoon's work at my office a day or two later, when my clerk brought me word that Lieutenant Richards of the police wished to see me. He came in rather impressively and seated himself beside my desk, but after his first word of greeting he let the better part of a minute go by in silence. Underneath his officially omniscient manner, it was possible to see that he was both puzzled and excited. "Well," said I at last, to start things, "who pays for that dinner at Churchill's?" He didn't answer the question directly, but brought his big fist down on a heap of documents that it took the office boy half an hour to straighten out again. "Your friend, Geoffrey," said he, "is a queer fish. He'll be blind to a fact that's as plain as the scare heads on the morning edition of an afternoon paper, and then he'll turn round and take a picture postcard and find out more from it than the whole department could learn in a week." "He was right about it then," said I. Richards nodded. "Are you sure he can't read Japanese?" he asked. "He said he couldn't," said I, "and I've never had any occasion to doubt his word." "Well, it beats me," said the lieutenant. "That printing was an address just as he said, spelled out in some sort of a flowery Japanese way, over on East 22nd Street. They made east with a picture of the rising sun. Can you beat it? Well, I had the place looked up, and she's there all right." "She?" "The woman whose other place we raided, the one who was doing the materializations. She's a clairvoyant now and crystal gazer. I suppose her husband's somewhere around in the background." "You haven't arrested them yet, then?" said I. "You can't arrest them yet," said Richards. "On the murder charge, the thing's too thin. Of course, any arrest in connection with that murder is going to be a tremendous sensation. And if we let the big noise loose before we get our case, we'll probably scare the case away. The thing to arrest them on is the charge of extorting money by the practice of magic. If they didn't know we suspected them in connection with the other thing, we might be able to get some valuable admissions out of them." "What's the difficulty about that course?" said I. "There must be some difficulty, or you'd have followed it." "There is," said the lieutenant. "She's keeping very quiet. She isn't advertising nor holding public séances. Nothing that would justify a raid. The only way to work it is to get someone to make a complaint against her." "I understand," said I. "Someone has got to go to her and consult her and pay her money and then complain to the police." "That's the idea," said he. "And the difficulty is that they're so shy and suspicious, and they know all the investigators so well that they won't take anybody but bona fide clients, and a bona fide client won't complain." My desk phone rang just then, and the next moment Gwendolen's voice was in my ear. If Gwendolen wanted to be a missionary and go about scattering sunshine, as the phrase goes, all she'd have to do would be to spend an hour or two a day calling people up on the telephone in the midst of their business worries and giving them the momentary luxury of the sound of her voice. "I'm in your outer office," she said. "I came down to sign those papers you wanted. It isn't important a bit, but when they told me Lieutenant Richards was with you, I couldn't resist asking whether Mr. Jeffrey had been right about the postcard." "Come in," I said. "We're rather at a standstill, and you may be able to help us out." "It's Mrs. Jack Marshall," I explained to the lieutenant as I hung up. He had looked a bit dubious on hearing me invite her in, but he lighted up immediately on hearing who she was. "The manicure girl!" he cried. "I wish we could pin a star on her and make her one of the force. Where we'd have been without her in that Marshall case, I hate to think." They greeted each other pleasantly, and it didn't take us 2 minutes to present our difficulty before her. She sat smiling in thoughtful silence for a moment after we'd done, and then electrified us both by saying, "I'll go and consult her myself." "You wouldn't want to do that, Gwendolen," I cried. "An informer's lot is not a happy one any more than a policeman's. You'd have to go into court and appear against a woman, and be subjected to an examination by a third-rate police court lawyer." "I'll go," she said, "but I don't promise to make a complaint. Perhaps I'll be so pleased with the fortune she tells me that I'll think I have had my money's worth, and shan't want to complain." "But the complaint's the thing we need," said the lieutenant. "We can't do anything till we get it." "I don't know," said Gwendolen. Perhaps after I've talked with her there may be some other way." She smiled again, and I saw the outline of that other way was already in her mind, though it was equally clear that she didn't mean to tell us what it was. Richard saw it too, and he laughed with a sort of amused vexation. "You're almost as bad as Mr. Jeffrey," he said. "You want the police to leave the thing alone until you've tried your hand at it." "Oh, no," said Gwendolen. "You can do anything you please. Only I thought you said you couldn't arrest her without an informer." "Well, you've got me," the Lieutenant admitted. "I shan't have to ask you to wait more than a day or two," she told him. Then she got up, nodded to me, said the papers could wait, and in another minute was gone. It only needed a glance at Gwendolen's face when I came home that night to convince me that she had made good her word, so far as her promised visit to the spiritualist went. But when I looked from her face to Jack's, I could see that he didn't approve at all of his pretty young wife's taking any more police problems on her shoulders, and I suspected him of wishing I'd kept her in the dark about it. Well, I more than half agreed with him. "You've been to see her?" I asked. She nodded and laughed. "And do you feel you've got your money's worth out of the fortune she told you, or are you indignant enough over the swindle to inform the police and have her arrested?" "The fortune certainly wasn't worth $2," said Gwendolen. "I could tell a better one myself with the grounds of a cup of tea. All about a dark man and a blonde man. Oh, but it was silly. But she seemed to feel that that sort of fortune-telling didn't amount to much herself. And when I got very sympathetic, she told me in a very spectral, blue-lighted sort of way that her real work was in acting as a medium for communications from the other world. She wanted to know if any of my loved ones had passed into the beyond, and said if they had, she could help me to communicate with them. I got very interested and trembly myself, and asked if I couldn't come to one of her séances. She said she wasn't giving them any more, not publicly at least, on account of the police. Then we both waited a minute, and at last I asked her if the spirits could come anywhere she wanted them to, because then we could have a private séance somewhere where the police wouldn't dare come. She said she could do it all right, but it came rather high. Introducing spirits into a private house seems pretty expensive business. It's going to cost $30. And Jack thinks that's awfully extravagant." "Extravagant!" Jack snorted angrily. "It's the only silly thing I ever knew Gwendolen to do." "But what is she going to do?" I asked. "Why, she's going to bring that woman here, tomorrow night, for a séance in this house. I wish you'd try to bring her to reason. I can't." "I want you all to come," she said. "Madeline won't. She says she's going to spend the night at the Crosbys'. I think that's just an excuse. But I want you and Mr. Jeffrey, oh, and Lieutenant Richards. I want you to call him up, Cliff, and invite him." At the mention of Richard's name, Jack fairly blew up. "What on earth are you thinking about?" he demanded. "We'll look nicely in the papers the next morning, shan't we? I should think you'd had enough of that sort of thing." "There won't be anything in the papers," said Gwendolen rather coolly. "I should think you knew me well enough to have a little more confidence in me than that." "But Gwendolen," I expostulated, "if you have that woman arrested here in our house for conducting a séance, I don't see how you can keep it out of the papers. On the whole, I'm inclined to agree with Jack. You'd better have nothing to do with it. Richards will find a pretext in a day or two for arresting her." "She won't be arrested for conducting a séance," said Gwendolen. "That's not the plan at all." "What is it then?" I demanded. She was silent a moment before she answered. Then she said, "No, I'm not going to tell you. You might make all sorts of objections. You just come to the seance. It will be down in the library at 8 o'clock tomorrow night, and see what happens. I promise you that you won't be sorry if you do, and that you will be sorry if you don't. That's fair. And now, if you still tell me to let it all go and pretend I never went to see her, never heard of her, I'll do as you say." "Jack's got the casting vote," said I. "It's his house and it's his wife. What do you say, Jack?" He laughed. "Oh, I haven't the nerve to tell her not to do it," said he. "A husband's authority is all very well, but it's an awkward thing to exercise it on anybody who's as likely to be right as Gwendolen." "And you'll come?" she asked. "And you'll let me have Lieutenant Richards?" "That's the bargain, isn't it? You're to run the show. We'll obey orders and no questions asked." "You're a dear," she said. "I've half a mind to tell you all about it, but it will be ever so much more fun for you if I don't. Will you call up the lieutenant, Cliff?" The Marshal's library was a big, rather formally arranged room, with a fireplace in one end, between a pair of bookcases, and opposite it, at the other end of the room, another pair of bookcases, with a mirror between. It was very dignified and rather solemn for an everyday family lounging place. I rather wondered at Gwendolen's choice of it, for it seemed to me that it, more than any other room in the house, was unfitting for her purpose. It would be almost profaned by a piece of charlatanism such as Gwendolen proposed to have take place there, but we had agreed to ask no questions. The next evening at 8 o'clock we all gathered there, except, of course, Richards, who had to keep in the background until the lights were out and the seance fairly begun. The medium herself was a rather rotund person, with a peculiarly disagreeable voice and a pasty complexion. Her cabinet, which was nothing but a wooden frame 2 feet square or so, and 7 or 8 feet high, stood in the corner of the room, behind where the medium was sitting. A little to the right from it was a small portable organ, which was apparently to be presided over by the medium's assistant. Jeffrey and I exchanged glances when we saw that he was unmistakably a Japanese. Jeffrey, Jack, Gwendolen, and I sat around in a semicircle opposite the medium. Jeffrey's chair was at the end, within reaching distance of the old library table, which had been moved over to the side of the room to leave sufficient space for our circle. There was a little doorway at the end of a sort of narrow alcove which led into the back hall. This door was left unlatched, and we had taken the precaution to oil the hinges. When things were fairly started, Richards was to come down to this door and station himself where he could observe events and take any action that they might render appropriate. I had attended seances many times before, and had long ago learned that they were always exactly alike, so that it was with no thrill of excitement or expectancy that I took my seat and waited for things to begin. Jack shared my feelings, and both he and I were puzzled to account for the demeanour of the other two. Of course, such things might be new to Gwendolen, but even novelty alone couldn't have given that added colour to her cheeks, nor quickened her breathing. As for Jeffrey, he was as excited as she, though all he showed of it, under a studiously repressed demeanour, was an edge to his quiet voice. We were all very hushed and decorous, as the etiquette is at such gatherings. The lights were all turned out except the spark from one high-low, which had been provided for the purpose. The Japanese went to the organ and began racking our nerves with hymn tunes frightfully out of key, both literally and figuratively, for we all had associations with them that made the cheap trickery of the present occasion jar badly on our nerves. After he had played a while, the medium began to talk, her throaty, unpleasant voice fittingly accompanied by the rasping wheezes of the little organ. Her English was as bad as her voice, and her vulgar platitudes and her supposedly mystic jargon were worse than either. After a little introduction she began to ask questions, with the perfectly obvious purpose of getting data for the communications we were waiting for. Gwendolen was the only one of us who was either inventive enough or sufficiently interested to make replies, but these were evidently encouraging to the medium, for she warmed to her work. There were a few preliminary manifestations, the muffled jangle of a bell, and some thrummings on a badly tuned guitar, and then suddenly, in a moment of stillness, a thin, childish voice spoke out of the empty air. It was pretty well done, and if I had not been waiting for it, and been perfectly acquainted with the trick of ventriloquism by which the medium herself produced it, it might have startled me. "That's my control," announced the medium in her own voice. "Now, if any of you have any questions to ask of any of the departed, Bright Eyes will give them power to speak and perhaps to appear before you. But I warn you to sit absolutely still in your places, as a single move might have serious results." There was a moment of silence, if the faint drone of the organ does not forbid the use of the word, and then Gwendolen spoke. "I wish to communicate with someone," she said. "She passed over on the 19th of December." It was perhaps 10 seconds before the medium answered. I wasn't thinking so much about her as I was about the date. There was something vaguely familiar about it. "What was the name of your friend?" the medium asked. "She never told me her name," said Gwendolen, "but she will know who I mean by what I can tell about her." "What can you tell, so that Bright Eyes can know who is called?" "She was very beautiful," said Gwendolen, and already the thrill of her voice was beginning to infect me with a new excitement. "She was young, about my own age, I think, and she had wonderful masses of beautiful blonde hair." The organ stopped playing, and the silence gave the situation a new thrill. I felt a current of air stirring about my feet, as if someone had opened a door. The thin, childish voice spoke now again, but somewhat uncertainly, as if the throat that uttered it were contracted with a sort of unreasoning fear. "It is not enough," it said. "I must know more." "The girl I want to communicate with," said Gwendolen steadily, "was frozen in the ice of the river. She had been murdered." It was a long half-minute before the childish voice spoke again. It was fainter still this time, and before it was half through the sentence it had died to a rasping whisper. "There is no answer," it said. "The spirit does not know who is called." It needed the grip of Gwendolen's hand on my forearm to keep me in my chair, because across the room, opposite where I sat, and almost behind the medium, there came a glow of bluish light, and in the midst of it, apparently itself the cause of it, appeared a face. "But it has come," said Gwendolen. "She is here. Look." Her voice was not loud, but it rang like a bell, not in terror but in triumph, and as she said the last word she let go my arm and pointed. For a moment the medium sat without moving, almost as if frozen herself and unable to move. But no one can resist the command of a finger pointing behind one, and slowly, unwillingly, but irresistibly, she turned. What she saw there at the far end of the room, shining in the bluish light it seemed itself to be the cause of, was the pale, ethereal face and the shining golden hair the blue light silvered, of the dead, mysterious, unknown girl the police had found frozen in the ice 2 months ago. The woman looked at it dully for a moment. Then she clutched suddenly at her neck with both hands. The next moment she screamed piercingly and fainted. There was a rush and the sound of a scuffle by the door. Jeffrey turned on the lights and we saw a strange man struggling out of Richard's grip, not toward the door, but toward the woman who lay unconscious on the floor. "Let go of me, damn you," he said. "I'm not trying to get away. Let me go to her." He kneeled beside her for a moment, without paying any further attention to us. But presently, when he found her regaining consciousness, he looked up and frowned at us across her body. "What have you been doing to her?" he demanded. "You might have killed her. If you had, you'd none of you have got away from me. What did you do to her?" The woman drew in a long, gasping breath. "It was the face," she said faintly. "It was Irene's face. I saw her looking at me." "Where did you see it?" he asked unevenly. "There," she said, and she pointed toward the big mirror that stood between the bookcases. We all followed the man's eyes as he turned about, but what he saw, and all any of the rest of us saw, was our own pale, astonished faces reflected there. He turned back to her. "Can't you forget that?" he asked. "Can't you ever forget it? What was Irene Fournier to you?" Jeffrey walked over to Richards and held out his hand. "Congratulations, Richards," he said. "It looks as if you were right about it after all." End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of The Ghost Girl by Henry Kitchell Webster. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10. The First Confession. If the circumstances had not been so grim, I should have laughed aloud. Richards was the most utterly bewildered looking man I ever saw, and the gasp with which he received Jeffrey's congratulations was funny enough to draw a smile from anybody. But the hysterical woman on the floor, and her husband's anger over what we had done to her, the perfectly genuine devotion that existed between the two, sobered us a little. "We cannot ask her any questions now," said Gwendolen decidedly. "Let's go into the billiard room and give her time to get herself together." The idea was so exactly contrary to police tradition that Richards started to protest. "Now is just the time," he said. "We can get anything out of her now." Jeffrey grinned. "All right," he said. "Go ahead and question her yourself." But Richards didn't know what to ask her. He hadn't caught up with the situation at all. He gave a rather disgusted grunt and turned away. "Do as you like, of course," he said. "Show the police how much more you know than anybody else. Go out and leave them alone to make a getaway through that window there." "Haven't you got an officer here?" asked Gwendolen, "that you can put on guard for a little while so that she can get quiet before we question her?" "Yes," said Richards. "We can leave her and her husband together to frame up a perfectly good explanation of everything." "That's the idea," said Jeffrey. "That'll do first rate." Richards gave it up. "All right," he said. "Come along." He called in a policeman, instructed him simply to watch the pair and see that they didn't get away, and the rest of us adjourned to the billiard room, as Gwendolen had suggested. "I want to know," said Richards, when the door was closed behind us, "what it was all about. What made the woman scream? I caught the man as he made a rush from the cabinet, but I didn't see what happened at all. And who was the Irene Fournier they were talking about?" "That," said Jeffrey, "appears to be the name of the girl who was found frozen in the ice. It looks as if you had the right hunch. It's perfectly evident that they know about her." "And what did you do?" asked Richards. "What made the medium scream like that?" "We had a materialization," said I. "Who produced it I don't know, but we saw the face of the girl who was frozen in the ice, the face we saw in the portrait up at Jeffrey's studio the other day. The rest of us saw it before the medium did. When she turned around and looked, she made a queer noise in her throat and screamed and fainted. You know the rest. But how the trick was worked, if it was a trick, I am as much in the dark as you." Jack turned to his wife. "It was a trick, wasn't it, Gwendolen?" he asked. She nodded and gave a little shiver. "I hate to remember that woman's scream," she said. "I don't believe I'd have planned it if I had realized it would affect her like that." "Tell us about it," I said. "How did you come to think of it?" "Why," said Gwendolen, "I've always heard that most spiritualists believe, in a way, in their own magic. Of course, they know that what they do is just a trick, but they believe in the back of their minds all the time that there is something really behind it. When I talked to her the other day, I saw that she was like that. We talked together for a long time, and it was perfectly clear that down in the bottom of her mind she thought there was something in it. So I thought that if we were to produce what looked like a materialization, play a trick on her, the same kind of trick that she plays on other people, she would be, well, startled into admitting something, but I didn't dream it would terrify her like that. Mr. Jeffrey agreed with me that if she did know anything about the girl they found in the ice, the trick would probably work." "But how did you work the trick? That's what I want to know. It's the ghastliest thing I ever saw. I was frightened myself, and I believe Jack was." He nodded. "Oh," said Gwendolen, "that was Mr. Jeffrey's idea. The thing I thought of was ordinary in comparison. The thing I thought of was to borrow his portrait and have it hidden behind a curtain somewhere, and then draw the curtain. But his plan was so much better that I doubt if mine would have worked at all. He deserves the credit for it." Then we all turned to Jeffrey. "Why, it was simple enough," said he. "If you happen to know a little about parlour magic, iridium, that's the answer. You paint a little film of iridium on the back of a plate of glass, and it has the property of being opaque to reflected light and transparent to transmitted light." "Well?" said Richards. "Why, we chose the library for the séance," said Jeffrey, "because it has a mirror in it, a big mirror. We took that out and set my portrait in behind it, and hung a bluish-white electric light over it. Then we replaced the mirror with a sheet of plate glass painted with iridium. As soon as there was light in front of it in the room and none behind it, it made as good a mirror as if it had been silvered. But as soon as we turned out the light in the library, as of course we knew the medium would do, it was possible to make the portrait show through the glass by turning on the light behind it. I had the thing wired so that I could put on the current gradually and work the switch from under a litter of papers on the library table. As soon as the woman screamed, I turned off the light, just before you turned up the lights in the library. Of course, when you did that, the glass became a mirror again, and the portrait was hidden." "So the medium still thinks," said I, "that she really saw Irene Fournier's face. She hasn't discovered the trick." "They use iridium mirrors a lot themselves," said Jeffrey, "and she may think of it in time, or her husband may, but I don't think they have thought of it yet. So I'd suggest," he concluded, "that we bring them in here and question them." Richards had already started toward the door to put this suggestion into effect when an exclamation of Jeffrey's halted him. We all turned to look at him and saw an expression of perplexity and vexation in his face. "What's the matter?" I asked. "The Jap," said Jeffrey. "What became of him?" "The Jap?" I echoed. "The man who was playing the organ," said Jeffrey, and at that we all stared at each other blankly. "He was playing the organ all through the seance," said I, "and then when we turned up the lights he was gone." "No," said Gwendolen. "Don't you remember how much more impressive everything got when I asked for the girl who was frozen in the ice? Don't you remember how still it was? The organ had stopped playing then." "You're right," I corroborated. "I remember now feeling a draught of cold air. I thought it was Richards opening the door." "I had the door open as soon as the lights were out," said Richards. "Well, we've lost him," said Jeffrey. "That may be important and it may not. We'll know more about it when we've questioned the medium and her husband. He may simply have smelled trouble and got away, without having any other vital reason for doing so. Anyhow, he's gone. Let's have the others in." Richards had already turned toward the door to carry out Jeffrey's suggestion when we heard a sound that froze us in our places for a moment, held us staring at each other, and then galvanized us all into sudden activity. All sorts of sudden sounds are compared with the muffled throb of a revolver shot, but really nothing else sounds just like it, and there is no question about the real thing when you hear it. As Richards flung open the door, we heard the officer we had left on duty calling for him, and as we ran out pell-mell into the hallway, our nostrils were greeted by the pungent, acrid tang of gunpowder. When we got into the library, we saw Barton, the medium's husband, lying on the floor, bleeding profusely from an ugly-looking wound in his neck. His wife was bending over him, and the policeman had hold of her. My first thought was that they had made some sort of concerted attack on him, and that it was he who had fired, but the sight of a dainty little silver-mounted revolver on the floor, a yard or two away from where the man was lying, put an end to that idea. One of our prisoners had fired the shot. Jack rushed to the telephone to call a doctor, and the rest of us gave our first attention to the wounded man. He had fainted, and his condition gave us a bad scare for a minute or two, but we soon came to the conclusion that the wound was not a fatal one. "Who did it?" asked Richards of the officer as soon as there was time for such a question. "I don't know," said the policeman. "The two of them were over there in the corner with their heads together, talking away in low voices so that I shouldn't hear what they said. The first thing I know, I saw a flash and heard a shot. I don't know where they got the gun from, or who fired it." The woman had paid absolutely no attention to any of us. Her white face, as she bent over her husband's body, showed no more expression than if she had been turned to stone. But after hearing the policeman's answer to Richard's question, she spoke in a voice as expressionless as her stony face. "I shot him," she said, "but I didn't mean to. I was trying to shoot myself when he caught hold of the barrel of the revolver." "You know that anything you say may be used against you," said Richards. "It's my duty to tell you that." "I am going to say something," said the woman, "and you can listen as hard as you like and use it all you please. That'll be better than—" Richards glanced round at the policeman. "Wait a minute," he said. "This isn't the time to talk. We've got to look after your husband." The police detective who looks forward to landing a big crime is as fearful of interference, as nervous lest someone else get the credit away from him, as a reporter who thinks he has a scoop. Richards didn't mind us. We couldn't get the credit away from him in any case. He was afraid of the policeman. The doctor for whom Jack had telephoned lived just around the corner and came almost immediately. It was at Gwendolen's suggestion that we have the wounded man taken to a spare bedroom instead of calling for an ambulance. That was a rather welcome way out of the difficulty to Richards as well as to ourselves. For a different set of reasons, we dreaded publicity about equally. Gwendolen took charge of our new patient until a regular nurse could arrive, and Jack went along with her. Jeffrey and I accompanied Richards back into the library where the policeman had detained the woman. Richards sent him out to stand guard outside. He examined the revolver in silence before he began asking any questions. It was a dainty, small caliber weapon, hardly the sort that a man would think of carrying about with him. "Where do you carry this?" was his first question. The woman answered by pointing, without a word, to an inner pocket in the coat of the rather mannish-looking tailored suit she wore. Richards went over to her, turned the coat back, and looked critically at the lining around the pocket. It was perfectly evident that she was telling the truth. The line formed by the edge of the cylinder was worn there clear across. "Been carrying it for some time, then," said Richards. "Yes," said the woman sullenly. "When did you first know Irene Fournier?" said the lieutenant. I began to get a better impression of Richards's powers. Compared to Jeffrey, he had always seemed downright stupid, but that question was cleverly put. I felt perfectly sure that Richards had never heard that name until the woman herself cried it out, on seeing the vision in the mirror, and yet his tone had the assured, contemptuous authority of one who could have given her police record from the time she was 15. He strengthened this effect a moment later, after waiting in silence for the woman to answer his question. "It was hard luck for you when you did meet her. Whenever it was, wasn't it?" In words the woman answered only the first part of the lieutenant's speech, but the expression of hatred on her face was a sufficient commentary on the second part of it. "I met her along last October," she said. "Well," said Richards, "how did it happen? How did you get to know her?" "She drove up to the house one day in a taxi," said the woman. "I thought she was some swell come for a reading. I thought she'd be a pretty good subject, too. She looked so innocent with those big soft eyes of hers, as if she'd believe anything you told her. The first thing that surprised me about her was her talk. She looked like an American all right, but she talked with a foreign accent. French, I guess, and the name she gave us had a French sound." "Fournier?" said Richards. "How did she spell it?" The medium spelled it out for him. "That's French, isn't it?" said Richards, turning to Jeffrey, who nodded. "Well," said Richards, "did you give the woman her reading?" "She didn't want one," said the medium. "She wanted to rent our top floor. Said she liked the neighborhood and wanted to live quietly. I said I'd have to see my husband about that, and called him in, and he agreed to let her have the rooms right off." "She was all alone?" said Richards. "Hadn't she a maid or anything?" "Why, yes, she was alone," answered the woman. "There was a Jap who came to see her every day. They'd have long talks together. It seemed as if she was giving him orders. He never had any talk with any of us." "He was the man who was playing the organ this evening, and who beat it when he heard we were asking about her," said Richards. He didn't say it like a question, and the woman made no answer, not even a gesture of assent or denial. "You and your husband got pretty well acquainted with her, didn't you?" said Richards. The woman nodded. "We took her into partnership with us for a while," she said. "How did that happen? Was she a medium?" "No, but she used to give us tips." "Tips?" I repeated. "About people," the medium explained. folks who had come to consult us, or who we could get to come. And it was queer how much she knew that we didn't, and we make a point of knowing a good deal. She told us about Miss Meredith. We'd never even heard of her. It was Irene told us she was rich and queer and all broken up about the loss of a niece of hers. She told us they were having the girl's portrait painted. She said she thought she could get the portrait for a day or two for a look at it, so that we could get ready for the old lady. It was then the talk came up of her going in partnership with us. It was the next day Miss Meredith came. We hadn't done anything about trying to land her. I suppose Irene had, though I never knew. She drove up in a carriage with a heavy veil on, and said she wanted a reading. I was going to give her one because I knew already from what Irene had told me enough to make a good beginning. But Irene wouldn't hear of it, made us send her away, tell her we were too busy, and make an appointment for her early the next week. She said that was the way to impress those people. Treat them as though you didn't care anything about them. We got the portrait the next day. The Jap brought it in."
"Did you know where Irene got it?" Richards asked.
"No," said the woman. "She said she borrowed it, and that we could keep it a week safely enough. It was the most wonderful thing I ever saw. It almost frightened me, and my husband felt the same way about it."
"How was that?"
asked Richards. "Why," said the woman, "it might have been painted from Irene herself. We both of us looked at it and said that if Irene only had that dress, she might have walked straight out of the picture. She said she thought she could get the dress, and the next day she had it. I don't know how she did that, either."
"You gave Miss Meredith a materialization the next time she came?"
The woman nodded. "We didn't dare let her see too much," she said. "We were afraid she'd go right out of her head. We just gave her a little glimpse in a dark light, but that was enough."
"Well," said Richards, "go on. How many more times did Miss Meredith come?"
"She never came again," said the woman. "She made an appointment, but she didn't come to keep it."
"Why do you suppose that was?" asked Richards.
"I don't know," said the medium.
"Hadn't Irene any suggestion or explanation?"
"Irene disappeared the next day herself."
"What day was it she disappeared?" asked Richards. "Do you remember the date?"
"Yes," said the woman. "It was the 27th of November."
"That must have been quite a shock to you and your husband," said Richards. "Didn't you make any inquiries? Didn't he make any effort to find her?"
"No. Why should he? We had nothing to do with her, really. She didn't owe us any money or anything. She came and stayed a while and went away. It was none of our business."
"She was pretty valuable to you in your business, wasn't she?"
"Oh, yes," said the woman, "but we could get along without her. We don't need any help from anybody."
"You couldn't hope to do much with Miss Meredith without her, could you? Not as much as you could with her, anyhow."
"Miss Meredith never came back, I tell you, so it didn't matter."
"Do you ordinarily let people go as easily as that? People that are once fairly hooked, especially when you know they are rich?"
"Well," said the medium, "we couldn't do anything without Irene, could we?"
"So you passed it all up," said Richards, "and didn't think anything more about Irene till you saw her picture in the papers, the girl they had found frozen in the ice?" The woman nodded. "Why didn't you come across then?" asked Richards. "Why didn't you tell us who she was?"
"We didn't owe you any favors, did we?" said the woman.
"You knew you were in wrong with the front office," said Richards. "We were pulling joints like yours all over town. You had a chance to get strong with us. If you'd given us the right tip about Irene Fournier, you could have gone on as you were, and we'd never have bothered you. You must have known that. Why did you let the chance go by?"
"I don't know."
"You and your husband talked it over, did you?" said Richards. "And neither of you thought of that?"
"No, we never thought of that."
"Why didn't you return the portrait when Irene went away?"
"How could we? We didn't know where Irene had got it." All the while the Lieutenant had been asking his questions, I had sat beside him watching the woman, puzzling over her sullen, half defiant replies. What she said hung together well enough, but the manner of her saying it was big with potential falsehood. What was the thing she was keeping back? The thing that would account for her scream at the sight of Irene's face, and for that unexplained revolver shot that had changed the face of things so suddenly? I wished that Jeffrey had been paying a little closer attention. After Richards asked a question or two, he had lounged over to the window and stood there looking out, without the slightest sign of any interest in the proceedings. I wondered if his indifference were real, or if it concealed, as it sometimes did, the materials for one of those intuitive flashes of his that used to make us all wonder at him. I wasn't left wondering long. "By the way, Lieutenant," he said, and he didn't even trouble to look around as he spoke, "when was it you raided these people?" Richards frowned thoughtfully and began thinking back. "Let's see," he said. "It was a few days after New Year's, the 4th. That's right, isn't it?" He asked the question of the woman, but she didn't answer. "And you got them both?" asked Jeffrey. "The woman's husband as well as herself?" "Sure," said Richards. "Your husband must have got home 2 or 3 days before that, then," said Jeffrey, turning now for the first time to the woman. "Got home?" she said. "What do you mean?" Her face had turned suddenly white, and her eyes were staring. "Fully 3 days before that," Jeffrey went on quietly, "because the paint was perfectly dry on the canvas when the police raided you. You didn't paint out the portrait until after he came back." "I don't know what you mean," gasped the woman, "about his coming back. He'd never been away." "Oh, yes, he had," said Jeffrey. There was more pity in his voice than anything else. "How else could he have found out that Irene had been murdered? The paint was dry on the canvas the 4th of January. They didn't find Irene's body until the 8th, and it had been frozen in the ice for 2 weeks. When was it your husband went away? The same day Irene did, or the day after?" It was a full minute before the woman answered. She just sat there while Richards and I stared at her, her hands fumbling at her neck, as if something were suffocating her. Jeffrey turned away again, but when she did speak, her words brought him around like a flash. "It wasn't him that killed her," she said. "He didn't do it. I swear he didn't do it. I killed Irene Fournier myself." End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of The Ghost Girl by Henry Kitchell Webster. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. An Escape. Those were the last intelligible words we got out of her. Richards pressed her with questions for a while, trying to get some details as to how the crime she confessed to had been committed, and where and why, but wholly without result. The woman was half hysterical, but she had self-control enough left to keep her jaw locked and her lips tight together, and the only answer she ever made was a desperate, frantic wagging of her head, which might have meant anything. So at last we called a taxi in preference to a patrol wagon for Richards and the policeman to take her to the station in. While we were waiting for it, he arranged to send a plain clothes man up to the house to keep an eye on the husband. The precaution seemed rather unnecessary, both because he was too badly wounded to make any serious attempt to escape, and because his wife's confession seemed to do away with the motive for it. While we were waiting for the taxi to arrive, Richards explained his theory of the crime to us. It was the typical police view, but it seemed to me to hold water, though I had a feeling that Jeffrey didn't look at it like that. Evidently, Richards shared this impression, for he tried hard to convince Jeffrey that he was right about it. "It is all explained now, isn't it?" he said. "This Irene comes to the house, settles down there, and gets friend husband buffaloed. She was a good enough looker to do it, that's sure. He gets loony about her, and the two of them run off. Wife left behind. She gets on the warpath, follows them up, finds them together somewhere, and takes a shot at the home destroyer. Maybe she leaves her husband to get out of the fix as best he can. Maybe she helps him. He can't denounce her, so he comes back to her or with her. I don't know which yet. Anyhow, they've got to stand by each other. When she sees Irene's face in the mirror, she goes off her head and tries to kill herself. There you are." He wheeled round on Jeffrey, whose face was still thoughtful and who had given no sign of assent. "What's the matter with that?" Richards concluded. "Doesn't that explain everything?" "Do you think it does?" asked Jeffrey. Richards threw up his hands with a gesture of exasperation. "Now, look here," he said. "I suppose you've got some dinky little silver-mounted theory that you're on the trail of, and that you'll try to show up the police with again. All right, go ahead. I've got a confession, and I've got a motive, and I've got a story that holds together, and that's good enough for me. If you think you can get anything better before this woman's case comes to trial—" "It will never come to trial," said Jeffrey. "All right," said Richards. "You wait and see. You go your way and I'll go mine. I'll leave you alone and you leave me alone. Does that go?" Jeffrey laughed and patted him on the back. We were standing in the hall watching for the taxi, and as Jeffrey spoke, its lights flashed round the corner. 2-1, Drew," he said, "that the lieutenant pays us a call within a week." Richards was too indignant to make an articulate answer, but it was a grunt that spoke volumes. The policeman led the woman down the hall just then, and the three of them went out together. "All the same," said Jeffrey as he closed the door behind them, "I wish there was a chance that the lieutenant was right about it. But there isn't. Not a chance in the world." After the lieutenant had gone, he favoured me with another prophecy and a bit of advice. "You'd better forget all about this case for the next few days," he said to me. "Get back to your office and make up for lost time. Nothing's going to happen for a few days. Nothing, at least, that you need bother about. But at the end of that time I suspect I shall be calling you in again. And when I do, I shall keep you pretty busy. So dig down to a clean desk if you can, before that time." I took the hint and followed his advice as well as I could. Of course, we had Barton still in the house, making as good progress toward recovery as a man could be expected to make from that sort of an injury, but he was under the care of 2 men nurses, and orders were that he was not to be allowed to talk anyway. So it was comparatively easy for me to forget about him. Easier, I suspect, than it was for Gwendolen. Equally, of course, I did think about it a good deal, especially on the daily trips up and down town from and to my office, trying to solve the puzzle, trying to see what it was that Jeffrey saw that made him so sure that Richard's theory of the case was wrong, so sure the case would collapse in the lieutenant's hands that he could calmly predict a further appeal for help from him within a week.
Nothing but the direst necessity would bring Richards to our doors again after what had passed between him and Jeffrey, and I honestly didn't believe he'd come. As I counted off the days, my feeling of skepticism mounted steadily. It was just at the end of the 6th, as I was preparing to leave my office and go home to a peaceful family dinner, that the voice of my office boy over the desk phone announced that Lieutenant Richards had come and wished to see me. I told them to send him in, with a recurrence of the feeling I had often experienced before, that there was something uncanny about Jeffrey. You could talk all you liked about lucky guesses and the balance of probability without wholly shaking off a feeling of almost superstitious dread when his prophecies came true like that. Perhaps this one hadn't come true, though. Perhaps Richards had come to gloat over us. Why had he come here, though, I wondered? Why didn't he go to Jeffrey himself? One look at his face disposed of that alternative before the big policeman had fairly shut the door behind him. "Isn't he here yet?" he asked. "Do you mean Jeffrey? Why should he be here?" "I've been trying to get hold of him for 2 days," said Richards. "This noon I got word by telephone, an out-of-town call, saying that he'd meet me here at 5 o'clock. "For 2 days?" I exclaimed. "I didn't know he had left town." Richards nodded sourly. "How about it?" I asked. "Does Jeffrey win his bet again? Is it for help on the Fournier case that you want to see him?" "This thing's past a joke," said Richards, as he noticed the smile with which I asked the question. "It's all very well to keep things to yourself and let other people go chasing wild geese, but when it's an important murder, that sort of smart aleck business is dangerous." I didn't point out to Richards that he had deliberately refused Jeffrey's help 6 days ago, because I knew he remembered it as well as I did. Besides, I was intensely curious and I wanted him in a good humor. So I placated him, as well as I could, with kind words and a good cigar, and his complaints subsided into a mere occasional rumbling of protest that Jeffrey was keeping him waiting. "It isn't quite 5 o'clock yet," I said, but just as I spoke, there came a single tap on the bell in the self-winding clock that sets itself every hour, and Jeffrey walked in. He nodded at me and grinned at the lieutenant. "Well," he asked cheerfully, "how goes it?" "Damn bad," said Richards, "and you know it." His grievance was wide awake again in a minute. "It seems to me," he went on, "it's pretty dangerous business letting the police go off hunting a mare's nest and leaving the real murderer that much better chance to escape, when you knew all the while the woman had an alibi." "Had she an alibi?" said Jeffrey. "That's lucky." "Do you mean to say you didn't know it? And what do you mean by saying it's lucky?" "I do mean that I didn't know it," said Jeffrey, "and it's obviously lucky, for nothing else would have convinced you that you were on the wrong tack. Was it a good alibi?" "Copper riveted," said Richards. "The woman never left town at all. The Barton woman. Irene Fournier went away and Barton went away, but Mrs. Barton never left her house all the while." "Making it highly improbable," commented Jeffrey, "that she shot a lady who was 50 miles away at the time." "She had the lady's revolver, though," said Richards. "The gun she shot her husband with a week ago." "A week ago tomorrow," Jeffrey reminded him, but Richards ignored the thrust. "Well, that was Irene Fournier's revolver." "By the way," said Jeffrey, "what is the caliber of that weapon?" "It's a .28, said Richards. "Why?" "I don't know. Curiosity." "Now, look here," said Richards. "I'll say anything you want me to say, admit anything you want me to admit, but I want you to stop this nonsense and tell me what you know about this murder." "That's easy," said Jeffrey. "I don't know a blessed thing. I hope to, though, within a day or two." "Try again," said Richards. "You can't get away with that. You just said you didn't know the Barton woman had an alibi. Well, then how can you be so dead sure she hadn't murdered Irene Fournier in the face of her own confession that she had, unless you know the person who really had done it?" "Why, I simply had a theory," Jeffrey began. "What I want is facts," interrupted Richards. "I've got a theory of my own." "What is it?" asked Jeffrey. "I'm not going to tell it," said the lieutenant, "until you come across with some of the facts that I am sure must be in your possession." "Oh, well," said Jeffrey, "then I'll tell you what your theory is. Irene still figures as the home destroyer. She deliberately infatuated Barton and ran away with him. The two quarreled. Barton found out something about her past, perhaps grew jealous of some other lover, and killed her. Then he came home to his wife, confessed to her perhaps, or perhaps not. Anyhow, he painted out my portrait on the canvas Irene had borrowed. Perhaps his wife guessed from that when the body was discovered." "He did paint out the portrait all right, and that's no theory," said Richards. "I know the shop where he got his paints and brushes." "All right," said Jeffrey. "That strengthens the case. Well, it preyed on the Barton woman's mind until when she saw Irene's face appear in the mirror, she blew up, made a scene, got her husband into really serious danger, and then made a confession to get him out of it. That's about the size of it, isn't it?" "Well," said Richards, "have you got a better one?" "I don't know that I have a better one," said Jeffrey. "Only that one doesn't seem to me quite conclusive." "What's the matter with it?" demanded Richards. "Why, to begin with, there's Barton himself. Barton's distinctly middle-aged. He's getting a little fat. His hair's thin on the top." "Don't talk nonsense," said Richards. "It isn't nonsense," said Jeffrey. "I don't quite see why Irene should be so anxious to run away with him." "He's just the kind pretty young women run away with," said Richards. "When they happen to be millionaires or something of that sort. But Barton, why, he's just his wife's understudy. I can't see why Irene should want him. And then, for the other half of the picture, look at Irene herself. Do you remember what Mrs. Barton said about the first time she saw her? Irene drove up in a taxi. She was dressed smartly enough so that Mrs. Barton thought she was some swell come for a reading. Now, when an adventuress of her looks and her attainments starts out to make a capture, she's likely to aim rather higher than poor Barton. It's inconceivable that she fell in love with him, and I don't see that she had much to gain by running away with him." "Well, you never can tell about a woman," said Richards philosophically. "I dare say you can't." "All right, have your little joke," said Richards. "But the fact is, she did run away with him." "Not from him?" suggested Jeffrey. "Play it either way," said Richards. "It comes to the same thing. He knew what happened to her anyway before anyone else did. He came home and painted out that portrait 4 days before the body was found." "Yes, there's something in that," Jeffrey admitted. "There's everything in it," said the lieutenant. "It looks good to me." He turned to me. "I'm going to send up and have him taken to the jail hospital this evening. It won't do to take any chances." My phone rang just then. I picked up the receiver, then turned and handed the instrument to Richards. "It's someone for you," I said. "Yes, I'm Richards," we heard him say. Then he looked puzzled. "Who's this talking anyway? Oh, Brown." Yes, I get you. Well, what is it?"
I glanced at Jeffrey, and he met my eye with a nod. Brown was the name of one of the two men nurses Richards had supplied us with, to look for Barton. The Lieutenant's face suddenly went purple.
"What's that?"
he roared through the phone.
When? When did it happen?"
There was another long silence at our end of the conversation, but there was no mistaking its import. Richard's dark eyes were flashing and his big fist beating impatiently on his knee.
"I don't care whose fault it was," he roared presently. "Have you reported to headquarters?"
He hung up the receiver with a jerk, without waiting for more than a bare word of reply, and swung round and glared at Jeffrey.
"This is a nice kettle of fish," he said. "They've let that fellow get away."
"Barton?" I asked. Richards grunted assent.
"Well, we'll get him," he said. "He won't get far. But I'll tell you this." He turned on Jeffrey again. "You can sit here and theorize all you like and grin your head off, but I am going to catch the man who murdered Irene Fournier. I'm through with theories."
"Oh, no, you aren't," said Jeffrey. Richards turned on his heel without another word and stamped out of the room. Jeffrey waited until he heard the outer door slam after him and then lighted a fresh cigarette. "I see the force of your objection," said I, "but you can't get away from that confession. The woman wouldn't have made a lying confession for anybody but her husband."
"Oh, she thinks he did it," said Jeffrey,
"and maybe he did. But when it comes to confessions, I've heard one myself. No longer ago than last night." End of chapter 11.